So, because of time, I'll get started, although I know that there are a number of people who've probably stepped out for a bio break. I'm going to give very brief parts of folks' bios. I trust that if you want to learn more about these extraordinary people on this panel, you will go to the website, check out the link, and learn more about them. So Cerise Castle is a Los Angeles-based journalist specializing in arts and culture, civil rights, criminal justice, and human interest stories. She wrote the first history of deputy gangs inside the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. She also created, produced, and hosted A Tradition of Violence, a podcast detailing the history and criminal activity of deputy gangs. If you've not yet heard this 15-part series, I cannot recommend it more highly. There's also a book that is coming out in 2026 with the same title and on the same topic. Clearly, I've not read that yet, but I will also be getting that when that comes out. That reporting earned her the 2022 International Women in Media Foundation's Courage Award, the American Journalism Online Award for the Best Use of Public Records, and the American Mosaic Journalism Prize. Alec Karakatsanis I literally practiced, is a founder of Civil Rights Corps. But before founding Civil Rights Corps, Alec was a civil rights lawyer and public defender, many in the audience, with a special litigation division of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, a federal public defender in Alabama representing impoverished people accused of federal crimes, and co-founder of the nonprofit organization Equal Justice Under Law. Alec has pioneered constitutional civil rights cases to challenge the size, power, profit, and everyday brutality of the punishment bureaucracy across the U.S. These legal challenges have helped to free hundreds of thousands of people from jail, return tens of millions of dollars to indigent people and families, prevented hundreds of thousands of illegal convictions, prevented the separation of thousands of families, and transformed the way the U.S. criminal punishment bureaucracy handles fines, fees, and bail. In April of next year, Alec's Propaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our Lives, will be published by the New Press, and so look out for that as well. Robert Vargas is a social scientist interested in research on cities, law, and race. His writing and teaching focus on identifying the political and economic forces shaping neighborhood conditions and city responses to social problems. His multi-award-winning book, Wounded City, Violent Turf Wars in the Chicago Barrio, brought a political analysis to the study of urban violence by showing how ward redistricting shaped block-level violence in the Little Village neighborhood of Chicago. His second award-winning book, Uninsured in Chicago, How the Social Safety Net Leaves Latinos Behind, is a longitudinal and intersectional ethnography of uninsured Chicagoans' experiences with the Affordable Care Act. Robert leads the University of Chicago Justice Project, a research group devoted to institutional change in cities. The Justice Project is pursuing two research agendas. The first is on the block-level historical trajectories of homicide, and the second is the political economy of policing. So welcome all of our panelists here today. I want to start with Alec. No time for claps. I want to start with Alec. So I'm really curious about how you were thinking when Adrian Walker said that he thought that things had improved, that over the past 35, 40 years, that journalism has become, or journalists have become more thoughtful in their reporting on issues of crime, his own experience. And when I read your work, it's not necessarily, in a kind of longitudinal perspective, but I get the sense that you might not necessarily agree with that. Can you tell us about the ways in which you think journalism has addressed the issue of crime? What are the issues that you see that make it difficult for us to understand what social problems are and how to make sense of them, and that's how to address them?
Absolutely. So just to start, I want to say I'm coming at this with a biased perspective. I'm an advocate for the most marginalized and impoverished communities in the United States, and so my perspective is of somebody who has spent their career trying to dismantle these systems of human caging and surveillance, and so I come at the analysis of the media from a perspective with that bias. So it's not necessarily objective. I'm also still a relatively young human. And so I can't purport to have conducted a study that really compares any kind of objective or quantifiable way how the news media was operating in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. You know, I've done a lot of reading and analysis of the news media from those eras. In particular, I recommend a book called Policing the Crisis by the amazing Stuart Hall and a number of collaborators about all of these issues in 1960s, 60s and 70s England. I think what my understanding from a lot of the reading that I've done and my own experience is that the question of whether it's gotten better or worse is not that significant or important to me, because what really matters to me is that the current state of information dissemination and knowledge production is abominable and inexcusable and causing tremendous amounts of unnecessary harm and violence. So whether or not it's gotten better or worse, I mean, the standards are still so incredibly low that it's an absolutely urgent matter for us to talk about what the problems are with clear eyes and to think through together what are the mechanisms of accountability for people who are involved in the process of informing or misinforming the mass public about the things that they should fear and the things that make them safe, and what kinds of social responses are reasonable and supported by the evidence to when you feel fear. So I think that there's so much to say about this topic.
Well, let me help to narrow it. So you want to challenge what is newsworthy and what isn't. We started with a session on whether crime is newsworthy or not. And I think that you have what feels to me like a very clear statement about the ways in which the news media help to shape what it is that we come to see as important. So I'd like you to talk about
Sure.
What you think the news media does in that regard.
I think there are really three main functions of what many people call propaganda. The first is narrowing our conception of threat. So the news media and the police play a vital role in making us afraid of some things and some people at some times and some locations, right? And then they ignore huge threats, far greater threats to our health and safety. So just to take one example, there was extraordinary coverage of a supposed wave of shoplifting over the last few years. Shoplifting from Walgreens, shoplifting from CVS, and it played a huge role actually in local political coverage, to the point where there were literally hundreds of articles written about a single incident of shoplifting in San Francisco a couple of summers ago. At the same time, there were almost no news stories in the mainstream media about wage theft. And the magnitude of wage theft, by conservative estimates, is multiple times the magnitude of all property crime combined in the United States. I'm not even going to get into tax evasion, which is about 20 times the amount of wage theft. So you don't see a news story every single night on all of the people that are committing wage theft. And of course, wage theft is a far more serious crime on any metric than shoplifting, because what it involves is people who have a lot of money and institutions that have a lot of money taking money from the working class people who actually need that money for diapers, for medical care. So that's just one example. There's so many examples, whether it's the complete and utter media blackout of environmental pollution crimes. So over 100,000 human beings die in the United States every single year from air pollution alone, much of it actually criminal air pollution. I'm not even getting into water pollution or plastic littering, which is trillions of pieces of plastic that are now in every living organism on Earth because of illegal littering, right? No one talks about that. There's not news stories every single night. And yet those things are actually fundamentally altering our entire ecosystems all over the world and killing. In the United States alone, air pollution kills 5 times more people than all murders combined. So, so the first thing is that they want us afraid of, in particular, strangers, immigrants, Black people, poor people, indigenous people. You can go down the list. You can different areas and different times. There's different what Stuart Hall calls folk devils. There's different people that are scapegoated. But the first major function is ignoring huge threats to our safety when those threats are caused by the way that our society looks and the distributions of wealth and power in that society, and when people who own and control wealth are perpetrating violence and harm, and focusing relentlessly on certain types of harms. The second sort of major function is having narrowed our conception of what is a threat to us. There is the constant desire on the part of, well, maybe desire is the wrong word. Let's leave out their intentions for a moment. But there's a constant barrage of making us think that that particularly narrow threat is always increasing. We heard on the last panel that if you look at the polling, every single year people think crime is increasing. But every single year for the last 25, 30 years, it's almost every single year has been going down. And the interesting point that was made on the prior panel is that if you actually ask people about their own neighborhoods, their perceptions are much actually more accurate. So when people are mediating their experience through the mass media, they're getting actually more distorted view of the world. But the goal of that, so the second feature of propaganda, is they want us to be constantly and increasingly afraid. And then the third thing, which I think is probably the most important thing, the thing that I think and write about probably the most, is propaganda kind of narrows our conception of what types of social responses are appropriate to those fears. So there's a huge focus in the mainstream media on the solution to every problem is more investment in the punishment bureaucracy. So if you remember, I think my favorite examples of this are after the 2020 uprisings, which really scared the ruling class elite in this country. I think the single most frightening moment for many people in the ruling class in this country was the poll that was released that showed a majority of people in the country supported the burning of the Minneapolis police precinct in the days following that incident. I think people were alarmed, and we saw an entire reactionary apparatus spring into effect. I personally focus on critiquing the sort of elite liberal response. I don't do a lot of talking about the far right. I think I'm much more interested in the role that liberals and liberal institutions, I do a lot of writing and thinking about the role of academia, the media, Democratic Party, in creating the conditions within which the far right and authoritarian vibes can flourish. But I think that the New York Times wrote a couple of articles that are very important in trying to understand this third function of propaganda. They did articles that purported to evaluate the massive failures of police to respond to the George Floyd protests. And those articles were about, supposedly, how in virtually every single city in the United States, police violated thousands of people's rights during those protests. And to hear the New York Times tell it, this was a series of mishaps and missteps that resulted from a lack of preparation and a lack of training and insufficient resources for things like technology and intelligence and stuff like that. So now that framing, and by the way, when I contacted the reporters about it and we started discussing it, they said, well, actually, it's not a story about the police violence. It's a story about what independent reports commissioned by the cities said about police violence. So that's why we're talking about that's what those reports said. And I said, well, the very choice in the New York Times to call those reports independent is very interesting. Like the Los Angeles report, by the way, was commissioned, but it was written by 6 former LAPD officials. That was the report that the New York Times called independent. And the conclusion was that they should bring back the COINTELPRO public order units, because the conclusion in that report was the police lacked the resources to sufficiently infiltrate the BLM organizers, and that they lacked sufficient things like enough handcuffs, enough surveillance cameras, things like that. So the entire article in the Times, you can imagine an article, and they actually did publish similar articles about the morality police in Iran, about the Cuban government's response to protests. When there's states that the New York Times conceives of as sort of like, enemy states, every time there's a crackdown on protest, it's seen as an intentional, deliberate repression at the highest levels, organized specifically with the purpose of crushing dissent. But in the United States, the same kinds of police behavior are portrayed as inadvertent. This is a really well-meaning institution that doesn't have an unbroken history for 150 years of crushing poor people, black people, indigenous people, queer people, anyone who's threatening the conception of power. So this third function is so important because it turns every single failure of this bureaucracy into a reason to invest in it further. And that, for me, is what I try to focus on in my work, because I think a lot of well-meaning liberals are they're the target of this counterinsurgency operation. They are the people who the New York Times is trying to get. They want to. These are people who think that they want a society with less violence, less police violence, but they're being steered down this path where the only solutions that are ever conceivable to these problems are increasing the repressive bureaucracies of the policing, and that, I think, is one of the most important things anybody can understand about propaganda.
So I'd like Cerise to step in and tell us what it would look like if those kind of guardrails that seem to be shaping how the New York Times approaches a focus on police and policing, what would we find if we were to remove those guardrails and really pay attention to their patterns of behaviors and practices?
To have a meaningful look.
Yes.
At
police. Share with us what you've learned.
Well, when looking at my work specifically, I cover criminal gangs inside the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. And what I've found in my work is a 60-year history of these gangs forming organically within the department and going on to completely shape the culture and functionality of the Sheriff's Department. For example, the past 3 under-sheriffs, this is the second in command of the department, have all been tattooed members of various criminal gangs inside of the department. In order to move up a rank in the department, it's essentially an unwritten prerequisite that you need to have either a tattoo associated with one of these gangs or at least a loose association. And by that, I mean being willing to look the other way when it comes to misconduct, being willing to falsify evidence or falsify a police report about a given incident, being willing to force your coworkers to give money to the gang leader for his personal use. Those sorts of things, they're common and rampant.
So how were you able to get access to the kind of data that enabled you to be able to tell this 15-part story?
Yeah, it really starts with a course that I took at the Ida B. Wells Society around public records. And that inspired me to go back and look for any reference of deputy gangs within our County Board of Supervisors meetings and various other municipal meetings that were going on over a given amount of time. And in going back and reviewing these meetings, I found in 2019 there was a meeting where the supervisors requested our county council to prepare a report on any civil litigation related to the deputy gangs. I put in a public records request for that report, and within 45 days they returned to me an Excel sheet that had over 60 different entries that was literally name, case number, gang affiliated with the case. And that created for me a roadmap. I used that to identify different deputies, sergeants, lieutenants, captains. I think it went all the way up to commanders that were involved in different incidents, whether it's a use of excessive force, a killing, find their names. And then from there, thanks to California's law around policing records, we now have some of the best in the country. The public is now allowed to see any records related to any time a police officer fires a gun, any time that they have been found to have used excessive force, been found to have been guilty of sexual assault or misconduct. I was able to use those names, find those records, and then find even more incidents. And oftentimes, which was really horrifying to me, I found that many attorneys that had ongoing litigation had no idea that the deputies that were involved in their case had done this 3, 4, 5 times before.
So outside of your reporting, how much did you see this reporting done in the LA area or beyond?
Yeah, I mean, my reporting was the first time that this history was really put together and chronicled. And this has been going on longer than I've been alive. Yeah. Which I think is a massive failure of legacy media and the institutions that were in place. I was so interested in this topic because there was no accounting. I grew up in the 90s. I was going to the DARE program, And we had these same deputies coming into our classrooms and telling us, stay out of gangs, they're dangerous. But then when they leave, the teacher is telling us, well, you know, there are actually gangs in the sheriff's department, and these are the signs to look for. It never made sense to me how both things could be true, and how when I went to the library, there was no book on this stuff. When I look at newspaper archives, there was no accounting. It was a one-off article every 5 years, and no follow-up.
Well, this sounds to me like a case where crime is news. Can you share with us the kinds of criminal behaviors that were associated with the deputy gangs?
Yeah, it's truly anything, any kind of interaction that you could conceivably have with a deputy in Los Angeles County could include some sort of deputy gang influence. I spoke to one deputy who was trained by members of this deputy gang called the Rattlesnakes. And he told me that it's when he was starting his first day of training, they told him, look, okay, what you need to do is get these stats for arrest, because the more stats we have, the more funding we get to our station, the more overtime we get, and the more we all get paid. In order to get an arrest stat, there are certain things that you can do to get an arrest. And that looks like, and they told him point blank, you need to look for vehicles with black males. You need to look for vehicles with Mexican males. You need to pull them over and take advantage of the fact that they do not know their rights. Take advantage of that to get into the car. Put them in your car. Question them. Search them. Do all of this with their consent and get those stats. That's, you know, that could be anything for like a traffic stop, for a broken headlight. That's a situation that someone could find themselves in. And it escalates to things like the use of pepper spray in people's eyes. There are many, many cases of deputy gangs going after males specifically, pepper spraying them in the eyes, in the groin, beating them with their flashlights, with their batons, killing people. In order to get into a deputy gang, you actually need to kill someone, and then they go on and they have a thing called a 998 party afterward to celebrate and get your deputy gang tattoo. Yeah, I mean, they really function like the criminal gangs that we have in our minds.
So, Robert, in the social science body of research, how pervasive are studies that focus on the kinds of harms that police do?
That focus on the harms of policing?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's large segments of it, like, but now that I think of it, actually,
Yeah.
to me, the most cutting edge work is actually coming from independent journalists.
Yeah.
So if we focus on the Chicago context,
Yeah.
like I think immediately of the Invisible Institute
Right.
and Injustice Watch. But when you look at the major academic centers devoted to the study of criminal justice and crime,
Right.
you would actually get a much rosier picture of
Uh-huh.
what the police are doing.
That's what I wanted to get to. So
It's like, got it.
some of your recent research actually, in some ways, I think helps us to understand why there might be a kind of dearth, if we can say that. I come at this from someone who's not studied, who had up until fairly recently not studied much about policing, but then wanted to do a study on police violence. I shared the paper with you and got some terrific feedback from Robert. But I bring this up to say when my collaborators and I delved into the bodies of research, we were actually surprised how much of this work seemed to be based on police administrative data, ride-alongs with police, and other sources of data that really implicated or centered the position or perspectives of police themselves. So it was really difficult, unless you were going to really focus solely on a very kind of critical police perspective, which is fine and very much needed within the mainstream kind of body of social science research. I thought that there was a bit of a dearth of it. And so I'm really interested in some of the work that you've been doing that sought to understand the role that academics have played in propagating propaganda.
Yeah.
And how that has been how they have helped to inform what the media has done to promote a particular viewpoint. So can you share that?
Yeah, so I'll answer that and then make an observation
Okay.
that's going to try to connect the previous
Okay.
panel to the current one. So I'm born and raised in Chicago. and have family that went into police, but also have been brutalized by police. And so for as long as, starting in 2009, when I was a graduate student, I always kind of scratched my head at presentations from researchers at the University of Chicago Crime Lab, who would make presentations about things related to policing. When the uprisings around the killing of Laquan McDonald came out and there was a subsequent homicide spike, kind of downplayed the role of the Illinois state budget crisis in contributing to the spike in violence. And then when 2020 happened, and everyone was putting out their statements of support to George Floyd and seeing them put out, I just couldn't help myself anymore, and just and wrote a critical op-ed of their work, and how you just look at their literature, you would think the police haven't done anything wrong in the last 10 years. And shortly after that op-ed, I got contacted by activists who were like, no, wait, the situation is actually way worse than you thought. We have FOIA'd the contracts between their researchers and the police department, and find that not only are they evaluating police on questionable terms that are baked into the contracts of what questions you get to ask and how you go about publishing the findings, but some of them are actually doing contract work for police. So they're simultaneously evaluator and contractor. And so I stepped back and put my social science hat on and thought, okay, I'm gonna try and generate a sample here, because I'm not gonna focus on an N of one and trying to scrutinize one organization, and see how prevalent this is in the broader literature. And so what my team did was scrape the grants made by the National Institute of Justice, Arnold Ventures, and the MacArthur Foundation for all policing-related projects. I'll spare you the details, but we retrieved all of the studies funded by them. We FOIA'd for all of the contracts between the academics and the police departments, and well as the backgrounds for the individual researchers to see if they had contracts, looking at public data sets on government contracts. And what we found is that most research on policing is not academic propaganda, but when you look at, over time, the media coverage of policing research, media coverage of these propaganda studies spikes after 2020. And so what we found, the way we're defining academic propaganda, and I think in a pretty narrow way, are studies published specifically to kind of contest or delegitimate critiques of the police. These are studies on things like mental health burdens, like getting police out of traffic enforcement, studies showing that police actually reduce traffic incidents somehow. And what's crucial about these studies, it's like similar but different to the media propaganda, is that it's couched under objectivity. The authors with undisclosed conflicts of interest are saying that, well, and they're being explicit, like unlike the activists who are the biased ones, we as the objective scientists do not take a stance on the issue, we're just simply trying to provide the evidence. And so that's what we found. And then one observation I wanted to make, because I feel like, Alec, when you prefaced what you said as coming from a biased perspective, the objectivity thing came up in the previous panel too. And there's that's the elephant in the room, I think, for academics and journalists. There's a historian of science here at Harvard, Naomi Oreskes, who's written amazing work on just the relationship between propaganda and science as it relates to fossil fuels. There's another great historian who studies this, Alan Brandt, on tobacco. And I don't know what the equivalent of this will be for journalism, but what they offer is a definition of science that's not grounded in positivism. And what I mean that because what we're talking about objectivity discourse is positivism, the aspiration to be neutral and objective. And positivism assumes universal values. And I think what's clear with what we have with crime, policing, and coverage is that there is no universal values. And at the very least, because there's that question, well, were you suggesting we get rid of objectivity? No, I think what we should be doing, I think what we're trying to do, the panelists here are trying to do, is push people to be more transparent about their values. Like, I can understand colleagues of mine, I'll just say like fiscal conservatives, if they're upfront about what their values are, and to then judge them, their actions and their statements based on whether or not they align with their values. And I feel like what's so powerful and destructive about propaganda is that Jason Stanley defines it as masking propaganda. And that's what academic propaganda is. It's using the liberal democratic ideal of science and objectivity to hide political interest in the background. And I think it's the duty of academics and journalists to try to untether that, to do something about it.
But your research also suggests that the stories that get told in the media are not randomly chosen.
Oh, yeah.
that it's the story, it's the studies that reveal positive outcomes resulting from police interventions.
Yeah.
And that also, in some ways, maybe deny the efficacy of alternative approaches to achieving public safety. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that's another big part. So when we dug deeper into the media mentions of the propaganda studies, like reading the content of it and seeing, we were surprised to see, like, there was, I thought this was like some sort of coding error from one of my RAs, but literally letter by letter, it was the same article in 40 different local media outlets. And what we found was, when you looked at the webpage, you would think it's written by a local journalist. It was actually, it was authored by the chief of staff of the National Policing Institute, who was actually a co-author of one of the studies. And when you read the content of that article versus what's actually written in the paper, what they're calling for in the media coverage is this is evidence that this particular police training is effective, that police departments should be adopting this across the country. And so, to the point about there's an added interlocked component of this to this world of consulting firms or PR firms that somehow like shape or have a lot of power over the distribution of media content that can blast things. And to be fair, this is a common practice. Like, I was an associate dean at the University of Chicago, the social science division, Harris, I'm sure Kennedy, the law school here, each has their PR firm whose job it is to help place things. But that, that again, it's like piecing together these webs of institutions that I think we need to scrutinize more. Like the networks between consulting firms, PR firms, police foundations, police departments, and the researchers. It truly is a multi-institutional, I'm thinking of calling it, somebody mentioned John Mearsheimer's work, something similar to a police lobby that is at work here.
So I'm gonna press you a little bit longer. You might not consider it pressing. You mentioned two mechanisms.
Sure.
And I'm assuming that in part these two mechanisms come out because those are mechanisms that you can actually examine in your research.
Yeah.
The data allow it, but that there are a number of other mechanisms that you probably don't have data to examine at this point. I bring this up because I'm, reminded about conversations with students, former students who wanted to study policing, and felt as if they were pressured to look at policing in a particular way, to deny the negative aspects of policing and really kind of uplift more positive aspects. I'm reminded of efforts to get me to become embedded with or collaborate with or, develop deep ties with police. It felt like there was I'm not saying, this was all planned or anything, but a real effort to create a community that assumed a strong relationship with policing that would, of course, shape how you come to research questions around policing itself. That's just one other way to look at this. So I'm wondering if there are other mechanisms that you imagine might be at play that could shape how academics come to do this work, and in ways that might make it so that we're less critical of what some are finding to be a very harmful institution and are uplifting.
So a couple of thoughts. For those who as familiar with the social science lingo of mechanism, I think one way to think of this is like presenting evidence of something that allows you to like see it empirically so that you know when you see it and when you don't see it. So it's like falsifiable to a certain degree. And you know, I think there's two very crystal clear cut ways through public records laws. I think you do this in other areas of research to identify academic propaganda. One is just the sheer conflict of interest of looking at researchers' backgrounds that are actively doing contract work for whichever entity it is that they're evaluating. The second is what we call police epistemology. Some folks call it cop thinking. And what it is it's you know, epistemology is like a worldview, a way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that is fixating on improving the police. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that idea by itself. There are many researchers who I respect who are doing great work on that topic. But when you enter into the world of media and public relations, it's a slippery slope because, you know, a similar kind of epistemology exists in the world of climate change and fossil fuels, which is we just need to make fossil fuels cleaner instead of becoming carbon free, right? And what I think is the problem here, and what I think is so important to like really push on, is that police epistemology gets cast as science. Yeah. It gets cast as the universal. When in order to actually envision a society without police, or even a society without fossil fuels, you actually need multiple forms of theory and epistemologies to be able to approach this and disrupt the status quo.
I'd like to bring it back to, and this is the last set of questions. Everyone basically gets the same question. Alec, in reading through some of your materials, I was taken by some of the recommendations that you made for how journalists might engage differently. So for instance, you described how they could introduce readers to as much background context as they can, make an effort to gesture to the public that there are other places the public can learn more about the context of these issues, show through story choice and framing that decisions by leaders and bureaucrats are political and based at least significantly on power and not based on the best arguments, etc., which all sound very reasonable. But not so much if you take seriously what you say is at the root of the problem, right? So if this is driven by all of these powerful elites who are doing this work from well before we would even think about picking up a newspaper, they've already in some ways established the kind of parameters around which we get the kind of news that we get, it's difficult to imagine the set of prescriptions that you put forward working in that context. So perhaps I'm missing something. Can you share more with me about that? And in the same vein or similar vein, Robert, I'm wondering if you can share any thinking that you might have about what we do in the academy so as to address what seems to be, at least among some, a conflict of interest that leads to a kind of promotion of pro-cop propaganda that doesn't actually do work towards promoting public safety, but does promote police organizations, et cetera. And then, Cerise, how do we think about being able to gain access to the kind of data that enables us to do the incredible reporting that you have done? So thinking how we would move forward in each of these directions so as to kind of put a cap on propaganda. Alec, you can start.
Sure. So I've written a number of little essays that are all going to be collected in the propaganda book that's coming out in a few months, but some of them are a reader's guide, sort of questions that both journalists and readers could be asking themselves. And I've even written sort of paragraphs that could be inserted into every single story on the criminal legal system that would provide necessary background. You could just plug and play. And I've written sort of a guide for what questions to ask any police chief, prosecutor, local politician at any local government meeting anywhere in the United States anytime, but those also serve as questions any journalist could ask to any of those leaders in any interview. And then I've also, come up with a number of recommendations for critical reading and thinking skills when you're consuming the news. I had that same internal conflict though as I'm writing all of those things, because those things presuppose institutions that want to be. So my own approach to solving that kind of conundrum is that I'm not going into this naive. I don't think that the mainstream news media is just trying its best and is just failing nonetheless. But I think that we have to apply some of the power mapping and organizing strategies that we do in our legal work to thinking about propaganda. So one of those things is I was trying, and I did this because a lot of the grassroots groups, whether they're jail closure campaigns, mutual aid groups, participatory defense hubs, groups in the M4BL ecosystem, abolitionists, whatever, actually student groups, a lot of them. I prepared these resources that look like they could be and should be for journalists, but they also are actually organizing tools. They're toolkits. There are high school and college teachers all around the US that are using these tools to teach critical reading and thinking skills in consuming the news. There are community organizing groups, so there are starting to be collections of directly impacted people, not just in the criminal system, but the family policing system, et cetera, that are coming together to talk about how to intervene in local media coverage. And so these are tools that anybody can use. They're organizing tools. Secondly, I think while these institutions, it's like Harvard University, right? I mean, there are a number of people, well-meaning people who are in these institutions who are actually have really no conception of how to organize. So a lot of professors, they think that their way of contributing is teaching students and doing a little bit of and I think someone said this last night, like maybe it was Professor Vargas or maybe it was Chandrai, but I couldn't agree more with the observation that was made at dinner last night, that a lot of professors need to learn how to be part of, and that requires a little bit of humility and a little bit of thinking more as an organizer and someone who understands power. Your contribution is not just doing research to identify the evidence for this proposition. It's also your own institutions are places where certain forms of power get enacted and certain forms of violence get sanitized. And so you have to be thinking much more like an organizer in your own institutions. And these institutions have to be holding each other accountable within it. And the news media is the same thing. I just cannot for the life of me understand why, some of the unions in these journalist organizations are not taking these issues seriously and demanding accountability for coverage that is destroying people's faith in the mainstream media generally. Another way that I sort of rationalize this to myself, or the time that I spent trying to identify these things, even though, I fully agree with the Chomsky and Herman model of manufacturing consent. I'm not naive. I don't think people are going to read my book and be like, oh my gosh, we have to change the whole. But another, there is this new ecosystem that was mentioned in I think your question. There's so many more people that are independently putting out information in the world, that are developing their own audiences, that are developing their own critical thinking and platforms. So like my work hopefully can be tools for all of these new people to think about the role that they're playing as they cultivate and develop and experiment with new forms of media, whether it's people that are thinking seriously about informing people through TikTok videos or through their Substacks. So I'm not just trying to influence the mainstream media. But I think at the end of the day, the thing that I keep coming back to is people of integrity in our society have an obligation not just to understand and cultivate in their own mind and fortify their own minds against propaganda and do all the things that are very difficult, and that require a lot of time and energy because we're being relentlessly propagandized. But they have an obligation to seek out others and to form community and relationships and to be strategic in how they fight back against it. And what I see from a lot of liberal institutions, whether it's journalists or professors, they're not being strategic in terms of how they're organizing together. I think the right wing does a much better job of holding people who deviate from certain norms and values accountable. And the people who, like, my own experience is much more tied to like what I see happening in like Harvard Law School, for example, because, you know, I went here and I still have a lot of like, there are a lot of professors here that have not had the integrity and the courage and the strategic thinking to actually say 2 + 2 = 4 when everybody else is saying 2 + 2 = 5. And if you can't come together and say that, then all is lost because you're going to be picked off one at a time. And so we have to come together within these institutions to organize. And this power is not set. Like, just because there are a lot of wealthy, powerful institutions that control what's happening in the media and academia, it doesn't mean that resistance movements can't fundamentally change consciousness and form, you know, powerful responses to those things. And I think we just have to. Part of our goal is we have to try, no matter whether we're a biologist or a computer scientist or an artist or a sociologist, we have to be organizing to build power in whatever space we're in, or else we're not actually resisting anything.
Cerise, what do you think?
I believe my question was on how to get your hands on the data.
Get your hands on the data, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, a huge assistance to me in my reporting has been the passage of laws that actually allow for this information to be disclosed, because in so many states, it's not available, and it's kept, like, quite literally under lock and key. So I would say, you know, advocacy for laws as such that further open up not just the press's access, but the public's. In states where this information is available, there's really no accountability for making sure that it's being provided. One of my ongoing projects is building websites where the public can actually go and look up shootings that have happened, officers that are involved in these deputy gangs, and creating a place where they can go and actually download these documents. Not just the public, but I mean attorneys, so they don't have to go through this whole, what I think is a pointless process of filing motions to get information that is disclosable under public law, or under law, I should say. And in places where this information isn't available, maybe there aren't any laws protecting the public's right to this information, and even places where there are, seeking out alternative sources of information, talking to people in communities, just as we were talking about on the last panel, building those relations, getting sources from people that have the lived experience, that have been in these neighborhoods for years. One of the best sources for the reporting that I've done, looking back at things that happened before I was alive, was going to these neighborhoods and talking to long-term residents that actually saw this stuff happen in front of them, and giving me places to follow up that maybe you wouldn't necessarily find when looking at the data.
Excellent, thank you so much. Robert?
I'll start with the simplest suggestion, which is that as journals are requiring authors to upload their data and code for replication, one simple thing would be for journals to require authors to post the MOUs or data user agreements that made their evaluation possible. A couple of other thoughts on things to do. So, like, a shout out to my PhD student who's now a postdoc at UVA Law, Chris Williams, who wrote an amazing dissertation that's going to become an amazing book on the movement to abolish cash bail in Illinois. And one of the most powerful lessons there, and take it as you leave it because it has, you know, I think downsides too, is that one of the ways that that abolitionist goal was integrated into the Democratic Party was through advisors to Governor Pritzker, who framed the message around ending cash bail, not abolishing, as being opposing this law is to be soft on crime. You could see how there's like that's not the way I would, but that is what made it politically palatable for it to survive, but also to survive what was an enormous propaganda campaign around how it was already causing increases in crime, even though the law hadn't been passed. It survived, and so like I take that as important to think with, but also hopeful, because you know we shouldn't give these propaganda campaigns too much power. They're not, you know, insurmountable. And then the last point, I think, is, I feel like most academics follow the incentives of their professions and disciplines and funders. And so I think what we need to focus on is holding funders accountable, holding philanthropy accountable. There are wings of philanthropy that are explicitly devoted to incremental change and some that are more towards transformational. And for those invested in incrementalism, I think you just have to point out the hypocrisy of how the vast majority of police surveillance technologies that are adopted undergo no evaluation whatsoever before they get implemented in Black and brown communities. There are legal scholars like Elizabeth Joe who argue that is literally human subjects experimentation on Black and brown people. It is Tuskegee in 2024. And so what I'm trying to convince people in this world is to embrace disruption, to produce transformational change. And there are some inspiring historical examples of this. Coming back to the tobacco example, in the 40s and 50s, the state of science was kind of like in a state where we're at now, where tobacco were funding physicians to appear on ads saying that smoking was perfectly safe. Interestingly, as like it was the life insurance industry that ended up funding the first studies linking smoking and cancer. But to me, what was one of the most interesting side details of that book was that, and this is the point about like getting academics on board, is that one of the professions that was most opposed to the movement to treat nicotine addiction through drugs was psychiatrists, because the largest provider of treatment for people addicted to smoking were psychiatrists, because it was pitched by the tobacco industry as a disease of the mind. And I think that's partially what's happening here, is that this movement towards evidence-based whatever, I think there are some of our colleagues who are capable of being convinced, that share our values, and I think there's other cases where it's just sheer material interests that are also at play here.
So why don't we open it up for questions?
Hi, this is a question for Cerise. Cerise, are there other gangs in other sheriffs in other states?
Yes. Tons, actually. So in California alone, I am aware of 2 additional departments that have documented gangs. I've been contacted by several people that work in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation that have spoken to me at length about the Green Wall, which is the gang inside of our prison system. There's even a book written by one of these former officers called The Green Wall of Silence, which I recommend. One of the panelists that's going to be speaking has written a book about the gang in the Baltimore Police Department. And I've been contacted by, I believe it's 32 officers in 32 different states that have asked me to come and investigate what they feel is a gang in their local force.
First of all, thank you for this incredible panel. I'm just blown away by everything I'm learning, and I really appreciate it. I think my question is primarily for Robert, but I think that it's a little bit about the academy, but I think it also applies in journalism. I think the way you're bringing out really kind of clear, explicit, and I think flagrant conflicts of interest is even sort of like a generous term to talk about the way that academics their research is being structured in relation to being consultants. But I wonder, one of the things I observed, and those of us who maybe have been through various kinds of education that I observed in my education, was people's politics being formed by their disciplinary training. We all came in as a cohort into the academy, and I went to Penn State, and it was like, but certain people, everyone was required to take quantitative research methods, okay? So but everyone was not required to take things like history, to take things like feminist studies, to take things like critical geography. So 2 years later, I had a colleague whose whole research was essentially about how to make Wii Golf better. Was like his sort of, project, that he was looking at in terms of like, computing. And I just, I feel like there's a similar thing about the fetishization of data and certain kinds of methods. So I guess what I'm asking is like, to what extent is that complicit? Because I think I find that even there's such well-meaning researchers who are sort of, for lack of a better term, shackled, constrained, influenced by their methods, which don't value historical data, patterns of continuity, and critical perspectives that you learn in the humanities.
Yeah.
When they try to tackle the problem of policing.
So I hear you and agree a lot with what you're saying. I feel like it's an issue that requires multiple people tackling it in multiple ways. And I'll say from experience, giving talks on this and everywhere in most departments, that starting the conversation by calling my colleagues propagandists is not the most welcoming invitation to a productive discussion. And so when I look at my positionality as an elite academic, who occasionally gets invited to these spaces to talk to the fetishizers, as you're saying, I lean towards using more neutral language, in part because I feel like, that in my view, there are folks who are going to be clearly incapable of being convinced, regardless of what evidence you're going to. Like, okay, let's put them aside. But I think amongst those who would be capable of being convinced, in some ways I feel like you have to handhold them, in part because that fetishizing of science, singular, is one that is fed to them from day one, from like kindergarten throughout. And so it's something that you have to be very delicate for, because people have their whole identities and sense of self-worth and value attached to that ideal. I was literally just having this conversation on a panel two days ago about the conception of the university. It's like the university being this hallowed ground, this place where we get to pursue knowledge. And so, there are ways of delivering them, and to, I guess, to more directly answer your question about complicity, like I was talking about with this Alec, I really do think that it's on a spectrum. Like I think you have folks on one side who are, hiring the PR firms that are out to get people, and you can see it. You look back long enough, and you look at who are the people who are authoring pieces trying to discredit the science around violence prevention, who are trying to discredit, and then, giving a very, very different take. I mean, you look at that's there. But, I think that for those who you're trying to convince, I don't know, I'm still grasping for the right terminology, but I feel like instead of trying to assign blame, I think giving folks ways to apply their curiosity and their knowledge to other things, like if you give them other data sets to work with, like the public records request to study other gangs, they'll follow where the data will take them. And that's my answer to that.
So we have time we actually don't, but we're going to take one more question. No, please, no, ask your question, and then our panelists will be available afterwards, so just don't hesitate to approach
Thank you so
them.
much. And I want to thank you all, guys. And I want to ask you, Cerise, after you have published your research, and have you noticed any change in the LA Sheriff Department? And when you were doing your work, what's some of it backlash? Did you face any?
So change. I'm a bit of a pessimist, so I just want to say that, the lens that I'm looking at this through. There has been some change that's positive, and I don't want to discount that. After the publication of my series, the Oversight Commission of the Sheriff's Department announced the first ever investigation into this issue, and they carried out a year-long investigation. They recently reopened it at the top of the year, and they prepared a report with 24 recommendations for how to end this problem within the department. The Sheriff's Department has not adopted any of those recommendations. They did introduce a policy about 2 months ago that formally bans deputy gangs for the first time. However, this policy was required 2 years ago by the state of California. And I have issues with that law in and of itself because it was written by a former police officer who was a member of a department that was actually shut down for corruption, and sponsored by a former sheriff that was a booster, let's just say, of deputy gangs. Since adopting that policy, our Sheriff's Department has appointed the first Black woman to ever be the second in command, and she is a self-admitted member of a deputy gang. They've also gone on to promote several members of deputy gangs that I've identified in previous reporting to the most senior levels of leadership. So yes, there has been some positives, but I also see a whole lot of negatives. As far as backlash is concerned, yes, I have faced an just a deluge of backlash immediately upon the series being published. I began receiving regular death threats, regular rape threats. I got calls from people working inside the department telling me that they had seen personal photos of mine posted on bulletin boards inside of stations, at entrances to different government buildings in Los Angeles County. I have received threats that are like really disturbing, talking about family members, intimate details of my life, threatening to kill my dog, people that I've dated. I've had my home broken into. I've had members of the Sheriff's Department come to my house and demand that I come outside to speak to them. It's completely changed who I am as a person, how I conduct myself, how I relate to people, and really everything about my life. Yeah.
I hate to end there, but I think we have to. Thank you for such a wonderful panel. This is amazing. Thank you so much.